Thank you very much. I would like to talk about fishing in the Mekong River and food security that is related to it, and what we may expect for the future, and I'll try to keep it real quick. First of all, something about the situation. Fish is a very important resource for many households, especially poor households in the world, and that is because fish is very easily accessible. You don't need much assets to access fish, just basically a hook or a net and maybe a boat, and that's the supply side. And for these households, fish means a lot because it contains proteins and micronutrients, and that's something that the human body really needs. In the case of Cambodia, when you think about a typical meal of a household along the Mekong River, it would usually look like rice with some kind of fish. So you will find rice with fermented fish or rice with fried fish. In Cambodia, the livelihood of about 25 to 30% of all households depend on small-scale capture fisheries. So aquaculture is not very widespread yet, so it's really capture fisheries. These people go out on the Mekong or other water bodies to go fishing almost every day. What else do we know? We know that the fish catch is already declining in Cambodia. That is because of overfishing. Overfishing has a number of reasons. One is the immense population growth in the last 30 years. So there are more people to feed. And then on the other hand, of course, is also the construction of hydroelectric power stations in the Mekong River, which when you think about small capture fisheries, they get fish from the Mekong that are off migratory fish species. And when you build these power stations, their spawning grounds are basically barred off so that these fish cannot reproduce properly. And furthermore, about the overfishing, there are also some fishing techniques like electric fishing and dynamite fishing that really decrease the fish stock. To make it real easily understandable how fish has an impact on food security, I would like to show you this little thing. The first one I think is pretty easy. So a household catches fish, a household consumes fish, and that means food security for the household. However, there's also another channel, and that is the household catches fish, sells it, and then takes the money to buy some other food supplies. However, that also means that through this channel, the income that is generated from selling fish may be diverted away from food. So actually it's not really clear that fishing automatically results in better food consumption for the household. Considering the situation on the Mekong River and doing field research there, there's a number of questions I asked to myself. So one is I wanted to know whether the food security status of fishers and non-fishers are the same, or whether there are differences between that. Because you see these people and you see that fish is important, but do you actually see it in the data? Do you see that the fishing households actually do have higher food security? And then I wanted to know which are the determinants of importance in a fisher's household. So you just saw that there are different channels. So is it really selling something that then increases nutrition, or is it the direct consumption of the fish? And lastly, but mainly most importantly, I wanted to know whether the declining fish stocks that we see will actually have an impact on households' food security. To answer these questions, I was lucky enough to do field research in Cambodia in the province of Stung Treng, which is in the northeast of the country. And this province is quite remote. There's little infrastructure. Actually, there was just a new bridge across the Mekong opened last fall. So that's really an innovation for this province. There are little roads, little bridges. The population in Stung Treng is heavily reliant on small-scale capture fisheries. You see that in here, these are our survey provinces, the survey villages, sorry. And you see that they are spread all across the province, and basically the villages were sampled proportional to size. And we have almost 600 rural households included in the survey, and we collected data from them twice. So we know everything about the period before, like 2012, 2013, and then 13, 14. So we have 2 periods. And this province is so sparsely populated that this sample amounts to over 1% of the province's population. So what does the questionnaire contain? We have information about socioeconomic factors of the household, such as the gender of the household head, education in the household. We know about their different livelihood activities, different ways of generating income, and we do have approximations of their annual income in the past year. Furthermore, we asked them about the food consumption in the past week. That means we asked them we divided the food that they could have taken into different groups, and then we asked them for each group, like for example, meats. Did you eat chicken meat? Did you eat pork? Did you eat beef? How much did you eat on how many days? And the same for vegetables, for fish, for fruits, and so on. And on top of that, we also measured the food consumption score. That may not be familiar to all of us. It's a score that counts how often a certain food group was eaten in the past week. So we have different groups, such as cereals and grains, then pulses and nuts. That's the second group. The third is vegetables. We have fruits. We have meat and fish. We have oil, sugar, and milk. And so you count the number of days that each group is eaten, and you weigh it. And the weights are chosen according to the nutritional value of these food items. And this is how we construct the food consumption score. For the food consumption, we could use that to calculate caloric intake and protein intake for the household. Okay. First of all, some descriptive statistics. Basically, what you see is once mean values for the whole sample, and then for the lowest 25% income percentile, and I distinguish between fishing and non-fishing households. And these are the means, and I used simple t-tests to just see whether there are differences in mean between these groups. Basically, the first block deals with caloric intake and protein intake. It is clear that in both groups here, the fishes had an advantage in caloric intake and protein intake, and this is the same when you just look at caloric intake and protein intake just from fish. Okay. Then when you look at the FCS, you also see that, again, both groups, you see that fishers do have a higher FCS, which means they should have better nutrition. When you deconstruct the FCS into the different food groups, you can actually see that it's not only FCS, the food consumption score from animal source, where we find the fish, that is different between fishers and non-fishers, but there are also the vegetables, that fishers eat more vegetables, and in the whole sample we also see that fishers eat less oil and sugar, which means less empty calories. So that indicates that probably they have a better, healthier nutrition. Basically, the results are not much different for the 25% income percentile. And down here, I further deconstructed this FCS from animal source to see where the differences actually come from. And you see that they come from fish, but we also see that there are no statistically significant differences in the intake of meat or eggs. So I would have thought that maybe non-fishing households make up for the lack of fish by eating meat and eggs, but in this sample we see that they don't. One more interesting thing about the descriptive statistics is looking at the different food consumption scores for different seasons, and we see that the planting season is the season with the lowest food security or food consumption scores, and you see that in the 25% income percentile, the fishing households, they have higher FCS scores in comparison to non-fishing households across all seasons. So to me that looks like these households actually have less seasonal food insecurity. Then we have own production and additional food expenditure, and we see that rice from own production is consumed more by fishing households, which kind of leads to the conclusion that they are more self-sufficient. And then we see that fishing households also have less additional food expenditure, which leads in the same direction. To go away from the purely descriptive statistics, I did a regression, and I regressed a measure of one's importance of fish in a household's diet and one's of food security. So importance of fish is the relative amount of fish. The relative amount of fish in the total proteins, the relative amount of calories from fish in the total calories, and the relative amount from fish in the total FCS, and then absolute food security measures, and I measured in total calories, proteins, and FCS. And I estimated this depending on a vector of fish consumption and fish sale. So consumption from own catch and sale from own catch. The same I did for livestock, because there was the thinking that maybe livestock had a similar effect. So I look at the livestock from own production consumed and sold, and then I control for additional food expenditure and subsistence rice production. First of all, the importance of fish in the total diet. What's interesting here, we see that the kilograms of fish consumed from own catch actually has a highly significant positive impact on the importance of fish in a household's diet. We see that this is not the case for the fish sold, so it's really the first channel that we saw, that households, they eat the fish that they catch, and that really gives them better nutrition. We see that, again, households which produce more rice also have more fish in their diet, eat more rice from own production, they have more fish in their diet. And we see that this is actually not related to livestock, which is clear, because livestock, if you have livestock, maybe you eat less fish and more livestock. And also the sale of livestock has a negative impact on fish here. Now we look at the absolute food security measures, and basically the picture doesn't change much. So fish consumed from own catch increases the total proteins and the total FCS, but not the total kilocalories, which is explainable because you can easily make up for calories that you don't take in via fish by eating more rice or eating other things. But it's not so easy to make up for the proteins that you don't take in, obviously. And then the FCS is also a measure that captures dietary diversity, so you see that here. Again, fish sold doesn't have the same impact. Additional food expenditure is highly significant, which is no surprise, I think. Again, the households seem to have more rice from own production. They have higher food security. And to sum up, so we saw that fishers have a better food security status. We saw that in descriptive statistics. We saw that on the last slide that fish increases overall protein intake and FCS. We also saw in the descriptive statistics that the poorest income quartile fishers suffer from less seasonal food insecurity. And we saw that it's only the consumption of fish from own catch that increases fish consumption and overall food security, but it's not the income generated from selling fish. And we also saw that obviously it's the more self-sufficient households that use a lot of fish. To come to the conclusion, and I think that's my most important point here, is that yes, we saw that fish is very important for these people to secure their nutrition, and we also know that the fish stocks are declining. So for me, that means that these people are actually losing a very important resource for their life and for their nutrition. And when we think about these hydroelectric power stations and other rural development policy, I believe that this policy should take into account its effects on fishery communities, because they are so dependent on the fish today that it will be hard for them to change. But we do know that this development will somehow happen, so we should think about how livelihood strategies of these fishing households can be adjusted in the future. And when we think about rural development policy, and they should also take into account the fishery communities and how they may transition their livelihood activities, so that in the end they won't be the losers of this development. So I suggest that further research should deal with this transition of livelihood strategies in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Any comments? Any question? Do you have, obviously, we all wish that the transition is successful, but do you have any ideas or way to suppose, driven from your data and interviews and questionnaires, have you any idea of the transition now happening or who can emerge?
Right now, we see that there's a little bit investment in aquaculture, which is very, very low still, and there's also evidence from research that aquaculture may be a difficult path, because aquaculture does mainly support those who can afford to invest in aquaculture. So it's not the poorest that actually benefit most from fishing that are, help with this transition. We see that a lot of households, they divert to different sources of income which are not sustainable. Right now in Stung Treng province, you see that there's still a lot of forest and there's a lot of logging going on, unfortunately. So that's one of the ways that households maintain their incomes, which is not sustainable. So I don't think that's a solution for the future. There are other activities which are not that sustainable. So for me right now, I really hope that the new infrastructure in the province will help the people to take part in a more, less agricultural way of earning a living. But so far we don't see many businesses. So maybe one of the solutions could be to help small businesses evolve in the area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ouais.